For the first time since this crisis began, all arrivals to the UK will now face mandatory quarantine. Travel corridors have been closed as the government tries to keep new COVID variants from Brazil and elsewhere out.
We've made such progress with the vaccine. What we don't want to see is all that hard work undone by the arrival of a new variant that is vaccine busting.
The PM wouldn't give any hint as to when restrictions might lift, but there was further good news. Cases are falling and the vaccine rollout appears to be speeding up. Also on News at 10 tonight. Why is the government worried about the variant from Brazil, and does it really differ from any others? Another hit to GDP as a result of the November lockdown, but the economy appears to be adjusting to the new normal.
Some guys started getting a hold of my gun and they were screaming out, kill him with his own gun.
The harrowing accounts of police officers beaten by the mob in the Capitol building. And it's been the most famous of magic tricks for a century, so we sent Damon to celebrate by having himself cut in half.
I've been assured that in 100 years of performing this illusion, nobody has ever actually died. There is, of course, a first time for everything.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. For almost a year, ever since coronavirus first became a global health crisis, there have been calls to pull up the drawbridge and introduce tougher measures on our borders. Differing degrees of restrictions have come and they've gone, but tonight the Prime Minister went further than ever before. From Monday morning, travellers to the UK from anywhere in the world will have to test negative before they set off, and when they get here, they'll have to quarantine. Why now? Well, Boris Johnson said it's to keep out unidentified strains of the virus following concerns about the new Brazilian variant. So far, there's no proof it would stop the vaccines working. And with more than 3 million people here now having had their first jab and signs the lockdown is having the desired effect, there had been hope rules could soon be relaxed. Not the opposite.
Planes may not have been a common sight in recent months, but checks at the border have been even rarer. With fears mounting about a dangerous new strain from Brazil, the government has finally decided to act.
Yesterday, we announced that we're banning flights from South America and Portugal, and to protect us against the risk of as yet unidentified new strains, we will also temporarily close all travel corridors from 0400 hours on Monday.
Anyone travelling into the UK will have to show proof of a negative COVID-19 test and isolate for 10 days. The quarantine can be shortened to 5 days if people pay for another COVID test and it's also negative. We've been in this pandemic for the best part of a year. Why on earth is it only now that you're putting in proper controls at the border? Isn't this yet another example of acting too late, which could cost lives?
What we're doing now is taking steps that you'd expect to protect against the new variants, because what we've got is a situation now is where we have a very high rate of as it were, domestic infection in the UK, combined with a massive vaccination programme.
Even without the new strains, the outlook is bleak.
The peak of deaths, I fear, is in the future. The peak of hospitalisations in some parts of the country may be around about now and beginning to come off the very, very top.
This is not a natural peak that's going to come down on its own. It's coming down because of the measures that are in place. Take the lid off now, this is going to boil over for sure, and we'll end up with a big problem.
Many hospitals are still struggling, in Norwich turning to the military for help to fill gaps caused by staff sickness. This nurse has been keeping a video diary.
12 hours done, and I'm exhausted.
So how does it compare with the first wave?
It's much, much worse. The numbers we're seeing are so much higher, and we're we're at breaking point. We're all exhausted and trying our absolute best, but the numbers are so much higher this time.
But there is hope elsewhere tonight. These pensioners queuing up in a new vaccination centre set up inside Lichfield Cathedral. Nearly half of all those aged 80 and above have now been vaccinated. Libby Vina, News at 10, Westminster.
Well, the new travel rules we heard about there were announced hours after a ban on arrivals from South Africa came into force. It is hoped that will keep out the alarming new Brazilian variant. The virus has claimed more than 207,000 lives in Brazil, a death toll second only to that of the US. One of the hardest hit places is the city of Manaus in the northwestern Amazonas region. It is estimated that following the peak of the first wave back in May, around 7 in 10 of its inhabitants had been infected. It was naturally hoped that as a result they had gained true herd immunity. And here's the bad bit. Since a new variant was detected there in December, infections have soared once again. Daily cases are up 51% compared to the peak of their first wave, bringing further devastation.
Where the city of Manaus ends, the rainforest begins. Only now the trees have been cleared to create new giant graveyards. And already they are full. Such is the impact of COVID on the Amazon's biggest city. Already they have to queue to bury their dead here. And the virus, back to torment Manaus for a second time, shows signs of inflicting even more death and suffering this time round. As the health service in Manaus is declared officially overwhelmed, scientists around the world are watching and they're worried. With 70% of the city population infected in last year's first wave, they hoped that would create herd immunity. That hasn't been the case, so is it a new strain of virus?
So thus far, we're not really sure about these mutations. The Brazilian variant has several mutations that are in common with this other one that arose in South Africa. And some experiments suggest that antibodies might not recognize this mutation as well. But most people think probably that even if it affects a vaccine, it won't knock it out completely. It just might make it slightly less effective.
A rampant second wave has seen Manaus hospitals running out of life-saving oxygen. These pictures show 5 COVID patients sharing 1 oxygen cylinder. Many others have been even less fortunate. This young woman says her grandmother died because the intensive care ward didn't have enough oxygen. A desperate shortage has even created a black market. Police found 33 oxygen cylinders when they stopped this truck and arrested the driver. Answering the calls for help, the Brazilian Air Force is now flying in oxygen from other parts of the country. They can't get new supplies soon enough in a city that thought it had already seen the worst the virus can do and is now wondering why its people are so vulnerable again. Paul Davis, News at 10.
And we can talk to Tom now about all this. Tom, good evening. I feel this is a conversation we're destined to have again and again this year, but it doesn't look particularly good, the story of Manaus, does it? How worried do you think we should be about this new variant and the way herd immunity didn't appear to work?
It really is, Tom, I have to say, too early to know whether what we're seeing in Manaus in Brazil is the reinfection of people who were infected with the old form of COVID back in their first peak. That data is a little bit uncertain. Obviously, if that is the case, it would be a strong indication that antibodies to the pre-existing form of COVID won't protect you against new variant, and that would mean that the vaccine might not be as effective. But it isn't proven yet. These two variants, both the South Africa and the Brazilian one, have 2 mutations in common, which are quite plausibly able to make it a little bit more resistant to the vaccine and to our antibodies. The research is going on to investigate how profound that might be. As you heard in Paul's report there, the hope is it won't make a big difference. But there is concern enough, obviously, for the government to decide to shut travel corridors today. The question is, did they do it quick enough? Now, look at the South Africa variant. We shut our borders to South Africa on the 24th of December. We learnt this evening from Public Health England there are now 35 cases of the South Africa variant documented in the UK and 12 probable ones. If it does have an advantage to a vaccine, for example, and resistance to that, that's plenty enough to cause that variant to rise in frequency. Could the Brazil variant be already here? We've got good surveillance, but it's not amazing. Hopefully it won't make too much of a difference, but remember, new variants can pop up all the time. You saw one pop up here in Britain. If we keep the case numbers what they are, we could perfectly generate our own new variants here as well. So they're all ones to watch, and we'll be keeping an eye on them.
OK, Tom, keep our fingers crossed. Thank you very much indeed. Now, across the UK, there are currently more than 37,000 COVID patients in hospital, with the peak of admissions expected in the next week or so. In Scotland, new rules come into effect from tomorrow, designed to reduce infections and ease pressure on the NHS. And it is an extraordinary strain medics are under at one hospital in Lanarkshire, which invited us to film inside. They this week took the difficult decision to cancel operations as the number of coronavirus patients continues to swell.
Almost out the door. This is the fallout from Christmas, when rules were relaxed.
Hi Mark. Hi. How are you doing?
Mark is just 51 and he's now in a high dependency unit. As was allowed, his family celebrated Christmas together at home. That one gathering has been devastating.
Yeah, well, our whole family tested positive through Christmas. About 9 or 10 of us, so my mum's, my wife's stepdad just actually he just passed away in his sleep at night, so we don't know where the primary source came from. And the knock-on effect of that is that my daughter's boyfriend's family, all their family's positive.
Mark knows where he contracted the virus, but others in here have no idea.
I hardly went out of the house except, you know, bathroom was off. So stay in, stay safe.
We're down a bit oxygen-wise at the minute. There's lots of patients like Tony here who need additional support. I think we can't help but be guided by what's happening further south in England, and I think all of us have a little bit of feeling of dread.
This was the infectious diseases ward at Monklands Hospital, but to cope with COVID patients claiming more and more beds, it's been taken over as a Redstream HDU.
They're already at capacity here, and more patients are coming in today, and more again will be coming in tomorrow.
These resources are finite. We don't have an unlimited number of CPAP machines, an unlimited number of high dependency beds, an unlimited number of intensive care beds.
How close are you to the point where you have to make tough decisions on who gets what?
It's a good question. My concern is that time is coming in the next weeks.
With this pressure, NHS Lanarkshire has just cancelled all non-urgent surgical procedures. But the strain of all this is not just being felt on bed capacity.
It's so destroying. It really is. I've gone home from work and cried so many times, and I've thought, is nursing really what I want to do? And then I come in and we're a great team. It's like an extended family. So we all get each other through the shifts.
How are the nurses here coping?
It's quite an emotional question, so I can see just walking around the hospital that the staff look tired. They tell me they're tired. Some of them tell me that they're at their end point and they don't know where they're going to get the energy to get through this next peak. And I think we'll be mopping up, the emotional impact of this for quite some time.
COVID patients aren't normally allowed visitors, but at Monklands this unit is on the ground floor, which allows for small mercies.
It's no easy, is it?
It's no easy.
I know, but we're fortunate, aren't we? At least I can see you.
George has been in hospital for almost 6 weeks now, but he got to see his family at Christmas and now for his birthday.
I was 65.
Last week?
Last week. Happy birthday, George. Who would ever have thought when they built this place a window would be so important?
These moments allow for something like normality, but behind the curtain there is little light on the horizon. Instead, in here they are preparing for these next few weeks, bringing their darkest days yet. Peter Smith, News at 10, Lanarkshire.
Poor old George, get well soon, like everyone else. Now, the situation everywhere is already exceptionally grim, but for Muslim communities hit especially hard by the virus, there is added upset when current pressures mean funerals cannot be carried out in line with their faith. You need only look at the number of new graves at burial sites to realise the extent of the tragedy unfolding. Well, to help prevent further deaths, imams use Friday prayers to encourage their communities to accept the vaccine when it is offered. Whatever impact that has, it will be too late to spare many families their grief.
A day of biting wind
Allahu Akbar.
and raw emotion.
She was a beautiful woman. She brought a lot of blessings to our family.
A much-loved grandmother is committed to the care of her maker.
Allahu Akbar.
And an entire family learns the cruelest lesson of COVID.
It don't hit you until it hits home. And now this is the biggest eye-opener I've had in my life. I got it first, and then it passed to my brother, my mum and my auntie.
Mahir's father was next to succumb.
For him to be in hospital scared that he's going to die, that changes you as a person. Do you know what I'm saying? So for me, it's brought me closer to God, but it's also made me understand how much of a risk we are all at.
Isa is a funeral director whose phone in these troubled times barely stops ringing.
This is only the beginning of the battle. The war hasn't started yet.
His personal front line stretches from mortuary to graveyard many times a day, and his colleagues are among the casualties.
I know at least 2 or 3 of them who has passed away with this COVID-19 because we are getting contact direct with the family.
The fresh flowers and the freshly turned earth point to the rise in burials at this Muslim cemetery. At others, we've learnt of an almost 10-fold increase in funerals each day. Looking at this, you begin to understand the scale, the enormity of what is going on. Begin to understand, too, the pressures and sometimes the delays in the system. And for a community which must, by tradition, bury its dead as soon as possible, that can add extra heartache.
We tend to mourn after the burial, so when we haven't been able to do the burial, it causes a lot of stress for the people that, you know, they're kind of like hanging in the middle.
A storeroom in East London.
So this is it.
Where the first peak of the pandemic was a rehearsal for this second, even deadlier wave.
How many coffins do you have here?
I think we had up to 30.
In normal times, how long will 30 coffins last you?
I would say 2.5 months.
And now?
We'll be going through it in 2 weeks.
85% of her funerals are COVID deaths.
Some deep level of COVID trauma is setting in. We are in the eye of the storm, right? Possibly next month, possibly another 6 weeks, right? And we have to be here to look after people.
Mahir's father still fights for his life. His family hope for the best. A community and a nation prepare for worse to come. John Ray, News at 10, Epsom.
I'm sorry, there's no way round how grim this all is, and as families suffer, there is a different kind of pain being experienced by many businesses. We won't know the impact of the latest lockdown for some time yet, but the prospect of a double-dip recession is now very real. That's after the economy shrank again in November, continuing a pattern we saw throughout 2020. The economy first contracted by a record-breaking, stunning 18.8% in April during the first lockdown. Then summer did bring a strong recovery. But in November, with the second lockdown in England, the economy again shrank, this time by 2.6%, leaving the year up to that point 8.5% below its pre-pandemic peak. Now, the vaccines provide a lot of optimism, of course, but some businesses are struggling to hold on for the return to normality.
The Thornywood Social Club closed its doors in March last year. It has yet to reopen them and now probably never will.
I got another bill in today. Final demand threatened to shut off the water supply. It's imminent.
Paul Wilson's landlord is demanding back rent in full, but Paul has finally run out of money.
I can't see a way out of this. I'll keep the lights on to the last possible minute. We've got obligations to people that have functions booked in the future. And yeah, we'll do what we can, but the day's coming ever closer. It's imminent now.
England went into a second lockdown last November. It is now in a third. The fight to contain the new strain of the virus has closed New Street in Birmingham and high streets across the UK, further delaying the recovery, increasing the risk of long-term economic damage. Around 1 million people have lost their jobs since the first lockdown last March. How much higher do you think unemployment will get?
The extension of the government's furlough scheme until the end of April will certainly help to prevent further job losses. I think the current lockdown will surely take some toll on firms. That does mean that unemployment will probably rise further from here. Perhaps another 500,000 people will lose their jobs.
The Chancellor says things will get worse before they get better, and he's right. But if the vaccine rollout continues to accelerate, there are reasons to feel bullish. When things do reopen, the recovery could be very strong. Many companies have cash, many households do too. Lockdown has caused terrible hardship. Some people have been forced into debt. A larger number, though, have been forced to save, and they will be in a position to spend when restrictions finally lift. Manufacturers can continue to trade during lockdown. This one in Walsall is introducing mass testing to protect staff and keep the production lines going. Amid the gloom, there's hope here. His order book is full.
We're planning double-digit growth this year. Currently we employ 230 people. We have vacancies for over 20 new staff. So we're actively recruiting, actively growing and, yeah, optimistic.
Some of the equipment made here is designed to prevent the virus spreading, and that must be the focus of everything now. Our health, our prosperity, depends on a return to some form of normality. Joel Hills, News at 10 in Birmingham.
And there was a significant boost for small businesses today with an important victory in the Supreme Court. It ruled that insurers should pay out for coronavirus-related disruption, a decision which could be worth at least £1.2 billion to around 370,000 businesses. The case was brought by the Financial Conduct Authority, which called on insurers to swiftly pay claims to firms for whom the money could, of course, be a vital lifeline. OK, well, let's move away from the pandemic now. And one of the most striking things about the storming of the US Capitol last week was the surprisingly small number of police on hand to try to hold back thousands of pro-Trump supporters. Some turned their anger on that very thin blue line standing in their way. Officer Brian Sicknick was killed, of course. Now others have described in chilling detail the threat they faced. One said as the mob wrestled with him, he heard someone say they should kill him with his own gun.
Their oath is to protect and serve, but as the Capitol fell, it was those in service without protection. As one of their colleagues suffered injuries which would take his life, others battled for theirs. Officer Daniel Hodges was crushed in the door as the mob surged.
There's a guy ripping my mask off, and he was able to rip away my baton and beat me with it, and he was practically foaming at the mouth. So just these people were true believers in the worst way. When things were looking dire, obviously I was calling out for all I was worth, and an officer behind me was able to get me enough room to pull me out of there, and they brought me to the rear.
Other officers pleaded for their lives as they were tasered and dragged through the crowd.
I remember guys were stripping me of my gear, and then some guys started getting a hold of my gun, and they were screaming out, kill him with his own gun. At that point, it was just like self-preservation. How do I survive this situation?
He considered using his gun to protect himself.
That would definitely give them the justification that they were looking for to kill me if they already didn't have made that up in their minds. So the other option I thought of was, try to appeal to somebody's humanity. And I just remember yelling out that I have kids, and it seemed to work. Some people in the crowd started to encircle me and try to offer me some level of protection.
Inside the building, colleagues had tried to hold back the crowd. It's now been revealed that as this group chased the officer up the stairs, baying for the vice president, Mr. Pence and his family had only just been bundled into a locked office.
Second floor!
The fallout from that night and the threat which still remains is turning this normally calm capital into a militarised zone, amid claims from prosecutors that rioters intended to capture and kill politicians. Not so long ago, scenes like this would have seemed fanciful, but so would a suggestion the capital could be overrun. The threat remains, and the land of the free feels far from it.
And we can speak to Emma in Washington now. Emma, no matter how many times we watch those scenes, they're just as shocking. How worried are authorities about the prospect of further violence in the run-up to Wednesday's inauguration?
Well, they're extremely worried, Tom, as the street scenes here demonstrate. It seems that every few minutes we see another part of Washington be closed down, more shops being boarded up, the metro being stopped, and more units of the National Guard being drafted onto the streets. And that is a scene that is being repeated in state capitals around this country. We expect in the next couple of days there will be armed demonstrations in all 50 states, and at least 12 have brought in the National Guard to try and make sure they are prepared for it. We're told by the FBI that they have evidence that is extremely concerning about the threat from domestic extremists. They see that as the biggest threat to the inauguration. And the reality is that, you know, nobody can fall back on that belief that, oh, it's going to be fine. It wasn't fine last week, and they're very worried that it might not be fine next week.
OK, Emma, thank you very much. Now back here, and at times he was magic on the pitch. Now Derby County are hoping Wayne Rooney will prove something of a wizard on the sidelines as well. They've just signed him as their permanent manager, a job he's been doing part-time, of course, since the end of November. It means the 35-year-old has officially retired from playing, leaving behind an enviable record as the leading scorer for Manchester United and England. Now, time for some real magic. For a truly great trick, you need to put on an entertaining show, build the suspense and keep it simple. Ingredients which have helped the illusion of sawing someone in half stand the test of time. The element of danger, leaving audiences scared to watch but unable to look away. It is, believe it or not, 100 years since it was first performed. So we obviously sent Damon to experience how it's done. Hopefully, we'll get him back in one piece.
It's a magic trick that's left audiences spellbound since the very first day it was performed. And as everyone who was there will surely recall, that was by P.T. Selbit at the Empire Theatre, Finsbury Park, 100 years ago this Sunday. Since then, anyone who's anyone in the world of magic has had occasion to saw a lady in half. Sometimes, if they were feeling very daring and were being paid a lot of money, they'd even do it to themselves. David's been performing magic tricks since the age of 8, and it's the one that always gives him a thrill.
When you perform the sawing in half illusion, you're in the middle of those boxes and you push them apart. It never fails to register with every single member of the audience.
And so began one of the most famous tricks in the history of show business.
It's the most imitated illusion in the history of magic. One thing that never changes is the need for a beautiful assistant, some of whom, of course, are household names in their own right.
I think it's still got that, you know, we all know that technology can do things, and so I don't think you're so baffled by something that's to do with television or a computer. But when it's a physical thing, then I think it has more impact.
All you've got to do is get in the box.
Lockdown has meant a shortage of gigs and a shortage of beautiful assistants. These days, if you need to saw somebody in half, it's on your front drive with whoever you can get.
I've been assured that in 100 years of performing this illusion, nobody has ever actually died. There is, of course, a first time for everything.
It's time to perform a classic of illusion. Sawing a lady in half. Are you ready for this, Damon?
I suppose so.
Let's do it!
But why a lady? Some say it was the growing women's equality movement of the 1920s that lent the illusion a dark significance.
It was kind of probably an illustration of keeping women at bay, unfortunately.
You're cutting someone down to size?
I'm not sure if cutting somebody down to size was the way Selbit saw it, but certainly maybe keeping them in their place, putting them back in their box. Who's to know what was going on in Selbit's mind, but it certainly registered with the audience at the time.
Anyone who discovers the secret of how this is done is sworn not to tell. And as they say, two people can keep a secret so long as one of them is sawn in half. Damon Green, News at 10, Northampton.
The very brilliant Damon, sawing himself in half. Honestly, we do everything on this show. Good night. Have a brilliant weekend.